If you live in a multifamily condominium or cooperative building in Florida that is 3 stories or higher, you will want to listen carefully to today's episode with engineer Tim Marshall. Tim is the president of AT Design, which he founded in 1986. AT Design provides, all right, I'm going to start that over. By the way, I didn't mention most of the screw ups are mine. So when we go back and edit, they're mostly my screw ups. All right, starting over. 3, 2, 1. If you live in a multifamily condominium or cooperative building in Florida that is 3 stories or higher, you will want to listen to today's carefully. Did it again. Okay. 3, 2, 1. If you live in a multifamily condominium or cooperative building in Florida that is 3 stories or higher, you will want to listen carefully to today's episode with engineer Tim Marshall. Tim is the president of AT Design, which he founded in 1986. AT Design provides forensic structural investigations, concrete deterioration and restoration investigations and assessment, roof investigation and consulting, construction management and project administration, hurricane damage inspections, post-tension cable repair, expert testimony, and more. Tim is a Florida registered professional engineer, a Florida building inspector, and a special inspector, which we're going to talk more about that later. Tim received his Bachelor of Engineering from Vanderbilt University. Tim, welcome to Take It to the Board.
Thank you for being here. I'm excited to be here.
So, with the passage of the new safety law, Senate Bill 4D in Florida, just how busy are you these days? I'm surprised I could even get you to appear on the show.
It has increased our workload substantially. I think the initial shock of the occurrence of the collapse down in South Florida, um, has kind of quelled down a little, but our phones are ringing.
I imagine our phones as association attorneys are ringing off the hook as well, mostly for 2 questions. Actually, I should say 3. What are the deadlines? Is there going to be a glitch bill that's going to change all this? My answer to the second one is don't count on a glitch bill that's going to take this away. And thirdly, where can we find a good engineer and a good reserve study company? So I'm so glad you're joining us today for that last question. In terms of the milestone inspections, Tim, the law is tied to buildings being 3 stories or higher. Now, I do get questions from clients a lot saying, well, how is that measured? Because sometimes we have a 2 story residential structure sitting on top of a parking structure, which would then raise it to the 3 story or higher threshold. Are you getting that question? And do you have any answer in terms of measurement?
That's an excellent question. Generally, the surrounding roadways is ground, zero, and any 30 feet or above, 3 stories or above classifies it. So if you have, as you said in your particular scenario, a residence or a building on a single story parking garage, it would be a 3 story structure.
It would. Okay. So, folks, you heard it here. So, can you walk us through the process of the newly required milestone inspections, which, by the way, have a December 31st, 2024 deadline for buildings constructed July 1st, 92 or earlier? I want to say that again. If your building is 3 stories or higher and it was constructed before July 1st, 1992, you have to have a milestone inspection. And a lot of people, Tim, they don't really know what that involves.
Okay, well, just as a little background, the milestone inspection really is a new law, but it has come in post the 40-year recertification program that was in Broward and Dade County, which means that any building, threshold building that is older than 40 years had to have these, what is now called a milestone inspection, but it was a recertification, and then have it on a reoccurring basis. After the tragedy in South Florida, the this went to statewide because we have buildings along the coast from South Florida all the way to the Panhandle and up to Jacksonville, and they essentially look at it as a report card from a licensed individual architect or engineer to provide a structural report card to the building department where they can evaluate the condition of the building based on that.
You know, for years and years, only Broward County and Miami-Dade that's 2 counties out of 67 Florida counties had that requirement. But you said the 40-year certification, and then the 10 years after that, the 50-year certification. Any idea why that was not statewide previously? With the milestone inspections now, it's going to apply to every building, every, as you said, threshold building throughout the state. But any idea why it was only Broward and Miami-Dade who felt this was necessary?
I would generally say because they're the oldest buildings in the state, starting with Miami and then to Fort Lauderdale. And really, the development of the state really started down there. Now, that's not to say that Tampa doesn't have old buildings, or Jacksonville, but the number of buildings in themselves is much less than in Dade and Broward County. And
And taller
that's
building.
always been my interpretation.
Right, and taller buildings too, I imagine, because I've been throughout the
Absolutely,
state. We have the highest concentration of high rises.
absolutely.
So there's two phases, if I'm understanding this correctly, to the milestone inspection. If phase one of the milestone inspection reveals substantial structural deterioration, then a more in-depth phase two is required. And the statute does, Tim, have a definition of substantial structural deterioration. Again, it's something that you're going to need to discuss with your engineer. But as an engineer, what are you looking for to determine if there is substantial structural deterioration in that phase one?
I'm looking for any type of signs of damage of the what I call the supporting elements, columns, beams, things of that nature. That is not just a what I would call a maintenance, which is more related to concrete deterioration, things of that nature. So, when you have significant structural cracks in your building from differential settlement, or you have your columns and your ground floor having large spalls or displacement, those are issues that need to get addressed, and that would constitute an immediate potentially shoring and things of that nature.
Windows and doors, structural, non-structural? I get this question all the time, and
That
I'm
is
not
an
an
excellent.
engineer.
That is an excellent question, and that is it is really since Hurricane Andrew, with all the wind load provisions in the building code, the exterior envelope has become a structural element. I equate it to the piece of Swiss cheese. You have a building, you've got holes in your Swiss cheese. They need to be filled by compliant uh, components, i.e., hurricane rated windows. And when they go bad, or when they're bad, or when they don't exist, you are potentially having uh, a a weak point on your structure. Um, I run into it a lot where I go into a building and we have 60 or 70% of the units have replaced to compliant windows, and the 40% still have their 45-year or their 50-year-old windows, which by definition have exceeded their useful life. They're structurally, they are depleted. Their ability to resist weather has been significantly depleted because of the wearing out of gaskets and mole hairs and the components that make them watertight. Many times they've been wet sealed. So that is a significant issue related to high rise, all structures, and it is specifically called for in the milestone inspection.
And I can understand that because specifically in a windstorm or in terms of moisture getting into the building. But for a non-engineer like me and the average layperson, you think about the apertures, a window or a door, and if it's gone, it's not going to destabilize the building on a, at least I'm asking this question, on an otherwise sunny day. I think that's why most people don't think of that as a structural element.
Well, it is that's it's a very difficult question.
Yeah.
The exterior envelope it's important that that stays intact during windstorm events. Of course, on a sunny day, it doesn't matter. But the skin of a building, the outside of the cube or box, whatever you want to call it, is important to be maintained so you don't have what they call internal pressures, and essentially the wind load pressures when it breaches the outside, the internal pressures in the building increase, and it creates other issues like the backside of the building windows will blow out, more moisture infiltration. So, but the element itself, like a column or a beam, the exterior element of a building, envelope of a building, is a structural element.
Yeah, and I know I'm gonna have people listening to this who are gonna say, "Now, wait a second, our documents make the apertures part of the unit boundaries, and that's the ordinary maintenance, repair, and replacement obligations of the owners." So please, for everybody listening, this does not mean we're saying throw the provisions in your documents out the window. Get a legal opinion, because there's a difference here between what's required under the milestone inspection and the structural integrity reserve study, and what may be required for regular maintenance, repair, and replacement under your documents. So my little disclaimer today. I should also put.
If I could add something to that, if I could interrupt,
Yeah, sure.
the problem there, it's not a problem, but it's a conflict where the milestone inspection report specifically calls for you to go and look and to render an opinion as to the that's the wrong word, the the um, the viability of the windows. Okay. And the issue that you have is this, is if you have a building, like I said, that's 60% replaced and 50% are originals, 40% original, you will have and you get myself to write your report and I say these windows are deficient, it could negatively impact the association. So it's a requirement by the state, but it also, not to and intentionally doing it, puts more liability onto the association. And it's one of the things why the building departments and the state have all come up to this, that they want the buildings to be safe, and not just a structural sense, a windstorm or weatherability resistant aspect of that is also because you're only as strong as your weakest link.
Sure. And in Florida, this has been an ongoing concern for the legislature for years. Years ago, they passed an amendment to 718, which said that a majority of your owners can vote to allow the board to install hurricane protection. So they can install impact glass and impact doors. So for those where the people still, you may, like you said in your example, 40% still have the old, potentially non-functioning windows. In that case, speak to your association attorney. Perhaps you should be taking that vote to allow the board, to allow the association to install impact glass windows.
I
So let's
always tell
say,
you this: if the penthouse unit had original windows and you're under that stack, all bets are off. That's the weak link. If you're above it, it's okay, but you're below it, it's not very fair. So
don't be the weak link.
that's right.
So let's say you've done your phase one inspection, Tim, and you have found significant structural deterioration, and you've put it in your report. Now, what's involved with phase two?
Well, phase two would be to further determine um, the uh, this the amount of damage and also the criticalness of the damage that you have identified. This has been an important part of mine that I have told my clients is that, you know, this is a report card to the state as to the structural integrity of a building. But when I write a report card to the state, that does not give me the information to go out and bid it out to fix the damage that we have done. So there's kind of even though it's an excellent program to maintain the buildings and let the state know where we're at, it doesn't help the association in moving forward. So we do a phase one, we identify, let's just say the building is in generally good condition, but we have, the ground floor columns have some work that need to be
Mhm.
done. We go from there. Okay, so we report to the association. I turn in my report to the city or the building official.
Mhm.
Okay, we go with the second phase to see the severity. At that point, it's got to be quantified, because when you go out to bid, the repair quantity is based on repair, what we have to repair, and the contractors bid on those quantities. So the phase two is really a phase two, because I
Oh,
can say how we're going to fix it, but that's one thing, but bidding out, you have to have the quantities and to do that. So it's kind of a one is a municipality words, the other is really the when the rubber hits the road.
But one is visual, correct? And phase two involves, does it involve destructive testing, Tim? Would you
It
actually
could
be
involve
removing concrete
it,
or?
it could involve destructive testing. I mean, quite frankly, and when it comes to concrete, that you want to make sure that if you're going to do destructive testing, as to the extent you don't want to, if there was a column that you said, was in the phase one that needed work, I would not do destructive testing on a column that was not properly shored. So you would have to get a
Of course.
contractor and you have to do that. If there was some window concerns or cracks in walls and we didn't know about moisture, that's a different story. But on a structural element, it kind of mandates that you bring in protections also if you're going to do destructive testing. But I find that the destructive testing more so is to locate or determine the extent of the damage rather than the severity of the damage.
I noticed a significant change under the new law. Previously, with the 40-year certification, the engineer would deliver that report to the board. Under the milestone inspection, I believe you're tasked with delivering that report directly to the local building official. Is that correct?
Yes, a signed and sealed document, and we do both. I mean, we're working for the association, so they get a copy, and we would bring it to the board to the building official.
But in the past, that wasn't the case. And I'm speculating here, and I'm thinking it's because the legislature has identified perhaps some communities where they got reports and then they didn't do anything with them or they didn't do enough. So, in this regard, the engineer is also alerting the local building official what the condition is of that building.
In fact, the I'm going to say old the past 40-year recertification that had to be turned into the building department also. I think
But by
the
whom? But by the association or by the engineer? I think it was the
I,
association who.
I think it was required by the association, but for my terms, I would do that because we misplaced it, we didn't get around to it, we didn't
Mhm.
whatever, and somehow we would get drawn back in. So I did that because in some respects, especially if it was serious damage, we have a responsibility for public safety, under our licensure, and so my personal preference would be to bring it to myself, but it was not a requirement, and there was a lot of problems.
Yeah, yeah. Phase one can be performed by a licensed engineer. Can an engineering intern help with the phase one?
Yes, he can, and it can be by an architect also.
Oh, yes, yes.
Um, but an engineering intern, absolutely under the direct charge, as it says in the Florida statutes, of the engineer, can perform under the supervision of a PE.
What
But
does it mean? What does it
ultimately,
mean to be an
PE,
engineering intern? How much schooling does an engineering intern have?
well, what happens is that they have, 4 years at accredited university, and then they come out and they take a test on, essentially the engineering classes that they took. That qualifies them for the engineering intern. Then they need 5 years experience under a PE. So what happens is that they come in and, they will have several years or whatever, and the engineer has to make a determination. And let's say he goes out and they start it together. And I like to do that as you go together so everyone's kind of on the same page. If he goes somewhere and says we have a situation, or I'm not comfortable with that, or this, you need to come see that, then I would go through. But ultimately, the responsibility falls on the
Mhm.
the PE to produce the document and to sign off on the document as to the integrity issues of the building.
Okay, so that's phase one, can be conducted by a licensed architect, a licensed engineer, or perhaps an engineering intern. Phase two, if Senate Bill 4D was drafted during a special session. I think they had 72 hours to cobble this thing together. So let's just say, needless to say, there's some improvement. We can do some clarification next session. But one of the questions I have, it seems to me that you need a special inspector to perform phase two of the milestone inspection. Because
That
again, elsewhere in 553, it refers to special inspectors and threshold buildings, and even Senate Bill 4D in one part refers to inspector.
There may be a clarification, and I've been a special inspector since 1993. In fact, I got it very early on when they started that um, program, and that really had to do with the development in South Florida and how the building departments could not perform all the required inspections. So they came up with that. I am both a BN, which is a building inspector, and I'm a special inspector, which means, I mean, at one point I was a special inspector, so I could do a threshold building, but I couldn't look at a house. It was kind of ridiculous, but the fact of the matter is this: an inspector, in sense, is a person that will go out and inspect the work being done or in accordance with the specifications. In terms of evaluating and assessing damage, that is an engineer. So that may be one of the corrections that they make. There is a law saying that if you work on a threshold building, you have to be a special inspector or a threshold inspector.
Yeah.
That rule is, I would say, is marginally followed. Um,
What's a threshold building, Tim?
a threshold building is a building over 3 stories or 2,500 square feet or occupancy of over 400. There's like six or
I mean,
eight.
if we were doing a Venn diagram, though,
Right, right,
that would
right,
fit right in the middle of what we're talking about here.
right. But all the concrete restoration jobs on a threshold building, by law, there should be a threshold inspector, which there aren't that many. And to qualify for this threshold inspector, you have to have both design and inspection experience. And that's what's difficult about it. So a person that had 20 years experience in the field, but very little design background cannot qualify for that, or someone who has a lot of design background and very little inspection background. So it's kind of it's a hard designation license to get, much more difficult nowadays. But and I think that I've been asked, you know, there's more engineers, PEs, than there are threshold inspectors.
Well, you took the words right out of my mouth because listen, when we knew SB 4D was going to pass, everybody was concerned there's not going to be enough Florida licensed architects and engineers to do all these milestone inspections because the deadline is the end of 2024, right? But
Yeah.
now I want to add this into the mix because I've spoken to a lot of I'm not going to name them, but a lot of very large Florida engineering companies. They do not have special inspectors on staff. So how many special inspectors do you know of that are in Florida?
There are a lot. Again, it's a difficult licensure to get because of the amount of design and field experience you have to have both. So it's really the best of both worlds. But uh, I personally know 4 or 5 that I could name off the top of my head. But I think it's something that's kind of gone by the wayside because you should have a threshold. Like I said, if you're working on a threshold building, you need to have a threshold inspection license.
Well, you may know 4 or 5, but there's thousands of associations. I will tell you, I'm telling my clients that when they are, vetting engineers, and I want to talk to you a little bit later in the episode about where people can find good engineers, I'm telling them they really should ask if there is a special inspector on staff because better safe than sorry. If it gets clarified that you do need a special inspector for phase two of the milestone, at least you're already doing business with an engineering firm that can supply that. I think you're going to get a lot busier in the coming after this podcast comes out. I did want to ask you costs, and I know it's different for number, size of the building, number of units. But are there any baseline that we could let our listeners know in terms of the cost for the phase one, because everybody has to do the phase one. Phase two is different because that's going to be tied to the structural damage. But for phase one, any ballpark estimates on costs?
It's difficult, and I'm just going to kind of give you background. When the catastrophe happened in Surfside, and the phone just went crazy. I have a crack in my building. I need to look at my building. I said to my clients and new and old, I said, look, it's going to be better for you if I come out on an hourly basis and walk around. I'm going to walk around, and quite frankly, if you've maintained your building, there's not, there shouldn't be much damage. It's just a time thing. I have to take notes, photographs, and then I have to prepare a report. In terms of cost wise, it should be relatively cheap, and I would rather say that than put a dollar value,
Mhm.
because the time frame to do it. Now, where the issue is when you look at a building and I walk through the hallways and the common areas, go up on the roof, walk through the parking garage, things of that nature, easily accessible. But part of the building consists of the individual units. How many units you go into? If there's 100 units in the building, I'm going to say you're going to go 20 to 30% minimum. If you find damage, you need to go to more. But again, too, if those parameters are defined at the beginning of the phase one, you can put a dollar value to it. But I don't want to, and this is kind of how I go, is I don't want to go in and get in something over my head. I'm losing money. I protect myself. At the same time, the association doesn't want to pay more money than really what should happen. And that's kind of, if you give a time frame estimate with a dollar value where you
Mhm.
think and then go through, that's where that is. Then you have to write the report. I mean, I'm sure now all engineering firms have come up with a format that they have developed in writing the reports and going forward. So, that kind of streamlines that. But there is a lot of information. I just finished one on an 11-story building. I think the writing was 10 to 14 pages. We had photographs. It was about a 25-page document, which takes time to compile. That just doesn't come out.
Sure.
The old 40-year recertification kind of had a checklist
Yep.
format, and I'm sure that you've seen this. A $500 40-year recertification, couple checks, oh, this, boom. And that's kind of what got us where we're at.
Absolutely, because that was a template where it was a checklist, nothing leapt out at anybody in terms of, and listen, I don't know about you, but I don't know that it's reasonable to assume that volunteer board members or even managers are going to sift through, multiple pages of exhibits. And even if they do read it, are they going to read it carefully and are they going to understand it? Because most of them are not engineers. So has the template changed? Do you think, I wanted to ask you that question, Tim. Um, After the Surfside tragedy, where it was the standard, checklist, poor, fair, good, on everything. Is there anything different where there's, a cover page where there's highlighting if there's a life safety issue, where you move that up the list? No, bearing in mind that people don't have the longest attention span.
Okay, so I'm just going to say this: life safety and engineering are not two good words phrases that go together. Anytime anyone references life safety, it is a critical issue, and I'm not saying that people don't think there's a integrity issue as opposed to life safety. So, when you use the term life safety in my book, that is an immediate issue that needs to get dealt with. Um, as to the template, and we can come back to that. As to the template, there is no, everyone has a different template. I like to keep it simple.
Mhm.
Let's start on the roof, talk about the structures, go down through the basement, talk about how the skeleton of the building, it's a conventional reinforced, it's post tension, you know, cast in place elements, things of that nature, reinforced masonry walls, stucco covered, things of that nature. Make it easy. When we come to the evaluation section and we go back to those individual units, that's where it should be able to say in writing, not too technical, this is what we saw.
Mhm.
And if there is a problem, at the end of the report, there should be a recommendation and it should address in the same format and maybe prioritize or address and then prioritize those repairs. And that's
I think you
really
might want, I think you should consider moving it to the front of the report. First page, and then go through
well, no,
everything.
I hear that. That could be it too. So I'll take that on advice from counsel.
So, you know what? I imagine because we were just talking about cost, the cost might be reduced if you are given comprehensive maintenance records. Is that correct? As opposed to a building that has shoddy or missing maintenance records. Does that make your job easier in
It would make
compiling the
it
report?
easier, you know, the plans, the full set of plans would be great because you like to look at that. You like kind of what you're going in. But more times than not, I run across the thing, well, you're the engineer, you know,
Yeah.
you need to figure it out. And it's like, look, the
It's like
more
a
information
puzzle.
we
Yeah.
get, the easier my job is, and the less time I've got to do to you know, evaluate the problem. You know, but you go in there with an open eye and the plans absolutely as you go there, because one, if you can look at the plans before, then you kind of know. But if you do see a problem, looking at the plans will then tell you. I recently had a building that was in relatively good shape, but the stairwells were cracking, and I learned that instead of four columns in the stairwell, there was only three, which caused the stairwell to bend and create these cracks, which is not, you know, it was a structural issue, but it was not a integral part or an integrity issue because of the they were missing. They chose to build it without a fourth column.
But you knew it was missing because you looked at the plans.
Absolutely.
That's important. That's important. I also want to mention to the residents listening to the podcast that you have an obligation to allow the engineering crew to come in and make these inspections. When you're compiling your milestone inspection, often we have people in units that they're not, how do I want to say this? They're not the most cooperative, not the most helpful when it comes to these kind of projects, but it's important.
Right. Well, I'm wearing a white shirt today, but usually I come in and I got a black hat on. And to see me, it costs money, and that's, you know, that's kind of the. But you know, quite frankly, I've been in business for, you know, 36 years. You know, I find that you hire me to do a job, and you know, probably 4 out of 10 times they don't want to hear what I have to say. I mean,
Well,
that's, I mean, it could
hopefully
be
that's
bigger.
going to change.
And
Hopefully
right,
that's
and that's
changing.
I do my job, and that's what's important to me because that's what you hire me for. So, you know, getting back to this whole thing about the dollar value and what happens, I think if you get a budget for time and how much you want to do, they understand that you can get it as opposed to just a dollar value because you don't really understand what it is. But the second phase, that's when the rubber hits the road. If we find damage and we go through, then that can be more pinpointed for cost to perform and specific locations
You know,
to
you
do it.
say they don't want to hear what you have to say, and I've had so many great guests on the podcast, including real estate professionals, bankers, insurance people. This is gonna hopefully change when new potential new purchasers start putting a premium on the safety features in the building. When they start rather than just looking at the floor layout of their unit and the view, they start looking around and they start asking questions about, when was the last time you did an engineering inspection? Looking around and seeing what things look like. Does the stucco look like it's in good shape? Asking about the roof, asking about the generator, the water pump, and everything. I don't know if we're ever going to get there because most people just think about what does my unit look like? Is the lobby pretty? And what does the view look like?
Well, I would say that's probably the majority, but people that have changed condos or have gotten assessments, I mean, every job I have, there's always the new resident that bought, you know, 8 months ago, and now there's a huge assessment, and I had no, you know, true or not, I had no idea that this was happening and whatever. So, you know, I agree. I think everyone is getting more educated. The boards are more educated. There's more requirements. You know, it has just become much more complicated a process now. Trying to meet the requirements, trying to be as open-minded and
Mhm.
as uh,
Transparent.
transparent as possible, and that's where we are. So, um,
And
it's
look, if
just
we come out
important.
on the other side with some of the safest housing stock in the country, that's going to be a good thing.
Right.
That's gonna be a really good thing. So I know you've done, Tim, a lot of your company's done a lot of 40 and 50-year certifications. And I'm sure you've done a few very recently before the new law passed. Are you being asked by your clients whether or not those recent 40 and 50-year certifications comply with the milestone inspection requirements?
I have not come across that question, but I have thought about it. And, luckily for me, I never did the checklist. I always wrote because I just don't think it gives a good enough example of providing professional engineering services. So my 40 and 50-year certification packages were more detailed anyway to kind of, that, so it wasn't a hard thing making it and
Mhm.
meeting the milestone. So, um, but that's a good question because I think just like you said, when these laws come in, there is going to be modifications and there is no provision to say if you finished it within this,
Right.
this is acceptable. And the format is going to modify it. They may come out with an outline. Now, I know that the city of Boca Raton, their ordinance 5589, has a much more detailed description of what they want to see in their report. And that, to me, and I've done some there already, and that's a pretty good outline.
Okay. All right. I just had to ask it because we're getting asked that question. And the answer is maybe, right? Because some
Right.
engineers like you have had very expansive reports even prior to this law passing, while others it may be too narrow. And so they may have to do an add-on in terms of additional, structural inspection.
Right. I agree.
So engineers, and correct me if I'm wrong, are required to notify the local building department if they find life safety issues in the building. Have you ever
Well,
had to do that?
why just actually working on a job right now that we had a corner column that we had to show what I consider emergency short. So to bypass the permit process, I went to the building official and assistant building official and told him of the situation, and they pushed through the permit for that column, and that permit to shore the column and repair the column went bigger for concrete, so they kind of reviewed it after the fact, if you will, but they issued it very quickly. And yes, I have done that.
But other than, waiving or expediting the permitting process, what should the role of local government be, in your opinion, in terms of ensuring that these buildings, these residential buildings are safe?
Well, the reason why we have these 40-year or formerly 40-year now the milestone is because there's not enough people on staff and inspectors on staff and qualified engineers on city staffs to be able to evaluate. So the mandate is to give a report card to the building official to as a report card of the structural integrity of the building, and that's really what it's about. So they can note it because they don't have enough. They don't have the staff to do that. And one of the reasons what led to the problem in Surfside was the fact that um, they weren't able to go bird dog it when it was given to them, and they didn't follow through on it.
Well, I was going to say, how do we ever have construction defects? If you have it being, if the work's being inspected every step of the way, right, properly inspected, how do you ever wind up with construction defects?
The problem is there's not a project on earth where someone well, I can't say that, but for the most part they see a majority, they see a representative sampling of it, and then they go away. You hire qualified people down the line. You go through, and for 2 hours a day you go and inspect. Well, for 6 hours you're not there, or you're doing another inspection and they're over here burying something. So unfortunately, and I do a lot of expert witness stuff and the 558, construction defects. A perfect example is the post tension anchors, cutting off the post tension anchors. I mean, the caps are only so deep. If you don't cut them off too long, you
Mhm.
can't cap them. It starts the whole deterioration process, and we're there. That's been going on for 15 years, 20 years. And, um, it takes and the repeated suits going after the people. So, um, you know, quality of contracting, oversight, and the responsibility down the line, not just the inspector to make sure it's done
Mhm.
right. The superintendent of the job has to look at it. The foreman of the site, the crew has to look at it. And a lot of times for myself in the construction fields, I think I'm a professional babysitter and not a professional engineer because we've gone over it. We've done this. What happened? What were you thinking? This is the 12th balcony. Why did it change?
Right. Wow. When I was installing just hurricane shutters in my house, the local inspector came out and they had covered something up already. And he said, rip it out. I can't tell from what you've already done. I want it ripped out so I can see and reinstall. And the contractor was muttering, saying, they never do that. And I said, well, they're doing it now. And I wonder if that's not the case on big construction jobs. If something's already been covered up, finished, covered over with concrete, how often does an inspector say, you know what, you skipped a step here. You need to rip this out.
Well, generally, all the high rises have threshold special inspectors that act in the city because the city can't see it. So, if I'm doing a 200 unit, 400 unit condominium, I'm looking at one thing for 2 hours in the morning. I'm going to go look at another area, because I've got to do my own. So, that's where it is. A perfect example of that is the installation of windows. It's kind of a pet peeve I have. You have a 40-year-old window, it allows air in, it chatters, it does all this. Someone puts a brand new hurricane window in, you shot the moon, you're happy. That doesn't mean it's installed properly. It's just a better window installed. So we have had probably the single biggest component that we've had problems with installation, not watching them, is windows.
Mm.
Because what are the two things? They will leak water after, because the caulk will eventually, pull away, or they're just installed improperly. They won't operate properly. So
The state of Florida rightfully focused on inspecting older buildings and making sure that associations are reserving money to pay for the ongoing maintenance and repairs. But to your recent point, I didn't see anything about budgeting more for local government to add building inspectors. I mean, even when we just had two counties, Broward and Miami-Dade, I had some clients that received the notice for 40-year certification 5 or more years late. They got them on their 45th birthday from the county or the city. And that was even before the Surfside tragedy, that the local government was just not up to the task.
yeah, and with the advent of computers and once your CO date, it's an automatic printout. But you're absolutely right. That those times have changed, and I think that it's going to be, what department is going to have the ability to read 500 structural inspection reports? I mean, when they come in. So, it goes down the line. I think it's a great idea, but at the same token, too, the workload is going to be phenomenal. And what they may do or they should do in the future, and again, too, it's a new law and it's going to be modified, made better, is that there should be a report and then a checklist that can easily warn the building departments that we did this is not just a standard building. It needs to be looked at, and then they can read the report. But I wouldn't want to be hired from the guy in the city that just reads reports and read, flags it up and then sets up the inspection. So this is the first step, and that is going to streamline eventually. But that may be where there'll be report, and when you turn it in, there's a checklist of
Mhm.
15 items that will keep a score or whatever, and then we go from there. But one thing you did bring up, the structural reserve study, and I've had a lot of questions about that, and that is a very difficult one, and I know it is a very important one because, irregardless of evaluating a building, realizing that you have to do it when the dollar value comes in, that's really when the pain starts.
Yeah,
And
how
so
are you gonna evaluate replacing the floor slab?
Well, I mean, we can estimate and give you estimated costs right now with the way the market is and products and availability and things of that nature, a little off the chain. But as an engineer, we do that. We do cost estimates. When we do evaluation, we will give you a projected cost of your project. Okay.
But isn't that dependent, I'm sorry, Tim, on, like, for, let's take concrete restoration, for example. Isn't that a per unit price? How will you know which, let's take 100 balconies, maybe 60 are absolutely fine, 40 are in desperate need of restoration. Or
Well,
are you just going to assume you're going to do everything at one time?
well, what happens is this: you have to look. You have to write the book. If you want to pick out a chapter, at least when you have the book, you know what you can do. And that goes back to the phase one, phase two. The phase one doesn't get you anywhere other than you need to go to a phase two and you meet the criteria that you have to turn in the city. Once you determine there's damage, then the rubber hits the road. But if I'm writing a report on the damage, it really doesn't do any good. And this is what I have said to my clients. I said, look, you know, I can do a walk around and tell you there are issues or not and be able to write a letter. But the next phase, if we see damage and it needs to be quantified, because when it's quantified, then we can go to bid. We can write the letter for phase two to the city, and I have quantities and I can go to bid and put the bid package together. And that is really, if I would say it would be phase three would be the bid package. And that may require additional investigation. So when you go to a phase two and do destructive testing, which would be sounding balconies and going to more balconies and things of that nature, that's the time that they should do it, and not a third round where, the association can be charged for the same thing that would should have happened in phase two. And that's where I'm at. I'd rather let you know up front where it is. And some people may determine we'll wait for that. But as soon as I write my letter in the phase two or do some selective demolition or whatever it requires to say, oh, we have damage, you need to fix it. Now we have to go investigate it and find out what the quantity is.
You've been doing this for a while. How many associations do you think opinion shop? Oh, we don't like what Tim said. We don't like what Tim had to say here. Let's get a peer review. Does that happen often, or have you been asked to give a peer review of somebody else's report?
I have been asked a couple times. I've testified on concrete jobs that have gone bad. Certain things, but what I find is, and what's been my experience, when I come in on relatively small, large jobs, anything at 2 million or above, when you come in and do an honest investigation, give them a detailed cost analysis, 85 line items, we've got balcony drawings, let's go look around, and they say to us, well, we don't know if that's whatever, or don't call us, we'll call you back. And then the second opinion may verify, which is rare. A second opinion comes in, it's lower, we'll go with the lower number. And then 2 years later, I'll run into the president, and this has happened, go, you know what, you hit the number right on the head or whatever. And that's just kind of where it is. So I recommend, if you're not comfortable, to get a second opinion. Absolutely. But find that if the second opinion comes in less, then the first opinion is out of the job, and the second opinion does it.
I mean, given what's at stake here, I think the goal is to be as robust with your engineering inspection as possible, not to try to find one that's a little wimpier.
Well, and I look at it a different way. To be conservative, okay. If I see a crack, or I see spalling, or I see PT work, or we see roof issues, to be conservative is to protect the association and protect myself, really. Not to the fact that we're going to CYA and cover, and it's going to be X, but it's conservative. If you see 2 square feet, don't mark down two. You mark down 3 or 4, depending on where it is and whatever. And when it all adds up, it's a conservative number. But when we go to bid, and let's say the job is $850,000, but when we're done, it's 1.4 million. When we're closer, and that's the problem, is people really just look at the dollar value rather than
Oh, yeah.
the effort, the effect of the damage.
And that's true across the board in so many different ways when it comes to the way boards sometimes think. Everything's so highly commoditized. What's the bottom line? What's the dollar?
Right.
I want to
Do we
switch.
really have to have a contingency?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you don't spend it, you don't spend it, but you have it available. And that's, those are the things. Tim, how much is it going to cost you? What's your engineering fee to do the project administration? I tell them, well, usually we tell everyone 10%. Okay. I'm going to charge between 4 and 8%, depending on the size of the job. If it's a $5 million job, it's going to be 4%. But whatever, it's an hourly rate. But you know what? It just gets you more in preparation of when you start chipping it open. That's just where it is.
And that's hopefully where the structural integrity reserve is going to come into play and kind of change that mindset because the money will hopefully be there as they start collecting it.
You're right, with this exception. If I have a good building and let's say they did a major job 5 years ago and they hire me and we have some minor spalling, this and that, to base a structural reserve study on putting money away on essentially small damage, it doesn't it's not you can't substantiate it. Now in your brain you can say, well, look, it's a large building. If we said we're going to put $50,000 a year in 20 years, we'll have $1 million, if not before. We'll do because when buildings continually do maintenance after they have usually it's after one big job, they'll start with the maintenance program. The maintenance cost should come down. I mean, it should be less. But it's hard when you come into a building and there's not much damage and it's an older building and there's going to be it's a substantiation of the number. And that really is for us engineers a very difficult point because it's so new to try to reserve because you have to, for me, I would have to substantiate why I said it because today or when I did our investigation, we did not locate much damage, but generally every 5 to 7 years you're going to have some degree of concrete restoration. Do your balconies have tile with no waterproofing on? Well, if your building is 30 years old and you don't have waterproofing on your balconies, it's just a matter of time before that hits. Well, how much is that number? how
Right.
how do you apportion and that's where the difficulty is because we do reserve studies too. And we have 12 years left of the service life. I need $1,500 in 8 years and I'll get my fully funded reserve for that particular item. But with the concrete it's all subjective and it's going to be difficult. The other part of that is I have big job in Boca right now where they are embarking on a large concrete restoration, elevator replacement, roof replacement, painting, things of that nature. And they're looking at large expenditures. And I said, look at it this way. When we finish this line of work, you will have the full reserve life of all your components. So your expenditures are going to be minimum as
True.
opposed to a condominium who did a big job 12, 15 years ago, hasn't saved a penny.
And
And
everything's coming up. The
right,
estimated.
right. So
Yep.
you're going to spend a lot on a very subjective analysis of a dollar value.
I say the same thing. Up until now, we've been talking about you discussing your findings with the board. Okay, here's what I've done, here's what it looks like. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about when you have to go speak to the members. Because I will tell you, Tim, that when I hear a board member or a manager say, "Yeah, there's not a problem with the building," I say, "What are you basing that on?" Well, the report. I said, "Are you the engineer who prepared the report?" Well, no. Please, board members, managers, don't interpret those reports. You're not engineers. By the way, I do have a few engineers on boards, and I say, don't wear two hats here. Get the actual engineer out to your meeting and let him or her discuss the report directly with your members. Hopefully, people care enough to show up to these meetings when it's something as important as, now the milestone inspection, before that, a 40 or 50-year certification. Have you attended a lot of those meetings? And then my second part of that question is, how do you impress upon the people listening if you have found structural deterioration?
I find the best thing is to have a PowerPoint presentation because pictures speak a thousand words. I mean, it's amazing how little visual people are. They can't visualize it. So what you do is you visualize it and you kind of teach them concrete 101. This is a problem. This is where it is. Um, for me, I go in and I don't have any agenda other than to tell them the truth, the legitimate truth. So I have no problem. People generally want to hear. Usually in a meeting, let's say there's 50 people, there's 45 that want to hear what's being said, five don't want to pay, disrupt, whatever. So, and I've dealt with that. That's not an issue. That's condominium life. The issue is to put a straight spin on it, visual aids, and it, for lack of better terms, kind of dummy it down. Keep it basic. They don't need to know any other engineering terms. Keep it basic so the housewife who just lost her husband, who can understand that there's problems and the building's not going to fall down, but there's problems that you have to fix. And I find that you get through the ruckus, especially on the bigger jobs, when you can get the 5% out of the way, and let them calm down, that people want to hear and they want to know what they're in for. And with the climate after the collapse in Surfside, people want to hear. They don't want any part about what happened. Now they're not happy about it, but I find them listening. I think it's harder to talk about windows replacement than it is concrete. I mean, concrete. Well, when's it going to fall down? Well, it's not going to fall down, and there's more years, and we're not going to do that. But the window I find is it operates. I can see through it. It's a window. That's
Right,
where it
right.
is. So that's where I'm at.
Well, let's talk about falling down. So I've seen in some reports concrete deterioration will accelerate, right?
Right.
Without any additional language, when's it going to accelerate? When is this deterioration going to accelerate, and what does it mean? So to a lay person, if you say, and you're at a meeting or someone's at a meeting, they say, well, the concrete's, of course, it's going to, unless you do something, unless you repair it, it's going to continue to deteriorate. For some people, that just means it's going to be an eyesore. It's not going to be dangerous. It's just going to be an eyesore, and I don't feel like paying to make it look pretty. How do you impart upon people that there is a connection between concrete deterioration and possible, impact to the structural integrity of the building?
Well, I've used this analogy. It's like an old car.
Okay.
The car could be 25 years old, rust holes in it, needs a paint job, it's got bald tires, but guess what? I can go to the store in it and it will get me home. In a sense, it's like with a building. The question is that it's like a cancer. Concrete is a sponge. It absorbs moisture. Salt laden moisture will attack any of the ferrous elements, the steel reinforcement, post tension. And what happens is it's like you pay me now or pay me later. If you do it early, fix it, it's cheaper. If you implement preventative measures, i.e., waterproof coatings on balconies to stop the water from getting in the horizontal surfaces, those are all going to save you money in the long run. So to me, when I go to a building that's 25 years old, there's concrete damage. They've never waterproofed. They haven't assessed for anything. They've just done the handyman stuff. I tell them, look, I can't tell you, is this balcony going to collapse? No, it's not going to collapse. But could a piece fall off the edge and hit someone on the walkway? Well, absolutely. And that's going to happen. And I'm sure that's already happened. We just haven't heard about it. But you know, I don't mix words. I'm there to tell them the truth. And and if it was my house, I would fix it. That's where it is.
Well, and that's the problem in the shared ownership community is you don't, with 100 units, let's say two people per, you don't have all those people making the decisions. You have a representative board that's hopefully making the right decisions. But then again, you also have a significant percentage of the membership saying we want you to do X, and if you don't, we're going to get you off the board, and we're going to get in people who agree with us. I do want
Well,
to
or
ask
the
you.
people that want to do X and then
Right,
they get off the board because they're spending the money. So,
right.
I've been on both sides of that, and that's changed. That's changed with reports to the building department, um, with phase one and phase two. The inspectors now, an electrical inspector go in and see spalling, go back and tell the the building that he saw spalling, and then you get a call from the building department. So, everyone is still kind of shell shocked at the tragedy that happened, but it's a good thing in the long run, and it
Because
needed to happen.
we will have a safer housing stock. I want to talk. You mentioned water and its impact on concrete. Two issues. One, we'll start with the easy. Well, this may not be the easy one. Is it ever advisable to lay flooring on top of concrete balconies, or does any type of flooring contribute to concrete deterioration?
Well, in a coastal region, there is absolutely no question about it. Any horizontal concrete surface has to be waterproof. There's no question about it. That we are using stronger concrete, and the stronger the concrete, the less dense it is. So it's less susceptible to moisture, but it is still a sponge, and it will get into the concrete. So if you're going to have put flooring down, you need to put a waterproof membrane under it, because it used to be the indoor outdoor carpet. Get rid of that. Then it's a tile. Well, if you take tile off, you'll see that the tile will be dry and underneath it's wet. It holds
Right.
water on the deck just like carpet did. It's much nicer finish. And back in the 80s, when they said get rid of the indoor outdoor, use that. Well, they told me to put this on. Well, it's still detrimental to the horizontal surface.
Because you keep learning more. Is it fair to say though that like a stamped concrete is the safest thing because you don't have anything sitting on top of the concrete?
That's probably the single most widely used coating in South Florida. And in our office, we call it tile denial. I don't care if you have tile; it's beautiful. My husband put it down. It was the last thing he did before he's here no more. And quite frankly, a lot of times you can't tell if it's hollow tile, poor job, or it's a spall. I mean, a lot of times you can. The use of a spray deck, deco deck, art deco. I mean, there's 100 words for it, and they can make slate patterns, tile patterns, and things of that nature. Is the availability to maintain your slab. And again, when we go back to the maintenance of the building, is the responsibility association to make sure that the structural elements are maintained. When it's hidden by tile, you just have it masked, and it makes it more difficult not only to see but to do any work on.
Well, I'm glad we covered that because I get that question all the time. So that is one source of moisture consistently being trapped on the concrete on the balconies. The second question I have, Tim, is the old design when developers in the 70s and 80s, even 90s, where they built the pools, they put the pool and even these parks, a lot of heavy plant material and overburden sitting on top of concrete parking structures, and you go underneath and there's water dripping through and there's cracking in the columns. um, what do you, are developers, first of all, are developers still building that way? I know density is important for them, but to me that seems like a design flaw. I'm not an engineer, which is why I'm asking you, does it
Well,
make sense to put a
generally
pool?
in a high rise, the pool deck is the main, the gym and the pool deck are the two features.
Right,
That's where it is.
right.
So, the question, I think the real question is do the developers or the builders really do the proper construction and waterproofing and things of that nature to provide longevity? As 558s go out, and lawsuits, they're doing better. Okay, and they usually have sub consultants looking at work that go through to try to make sure that they don't get sued because the work is done properly or improperly. But the problem is waterproofing. Even the best waterproofing is 20 years. 20 years.
And by
So
then the developer's long gone, has
right, but
sold
it's
out.
long
I mean,
gone, and
right.
and it's on the association again, and again, it's an expenditure. Well, the other part too is we have lovely palm trees on our deck. They're 35 feet high. It's Gilligan's Island all over.
Mhm.
Well, that palm tree is root balled into that creating problems in that planner that in itself is self-destructing. So to get it out, you got to chop it up. To get a new one, you got to get a crane. It's just expensive when it's in the air. But I have found that the waterproofing and construction of elevated decks has become better. It used to be kind of the wild, wild west, but it has become. But as you get 15 to 20 years, you're replacing it. You're doing
Right.
a major rehab.
Yeah, it looks fantastic when the developer's selling, and there's not going to be problems for the first maybe 2 decades. But when you're 40, 50, 60 years old, that building at that point, that's a major problem in terms of all that overburden sitting on top of a concrete structure.
Right.
I have a couple clients right now that have completely removed all the live plants, like you said, the mature plant material, the mature palms, and they're replacing it with silk and materials that are, lighter, and they're doing a complete waterproofing on that deck.
The one of the things that the uh, 30-year this milestone inspection, they talked about deflection as not being a critical structural. That's not true at all. Deflection, due to sagging or deflection is a huge issue. I mean, everything deflects when it's spanning, if you will. If I'm going to put a planter on a deck, I'm going to put it over a column. So all the weight is transferred right to a vertical element. I'm not stressing the deck. Things of that nature have all changed too. And I don't want to have this, quarter acre planter.
Right.
We don't need that either. We can have an artificial grass over turf. Some of the options that are coming up, drip irrigation over, regular irrigation.
But
All
that's really a good point, and I'll tell you why, because a lot of what we see now, decades later in older buildings, who have tried to, they've tried to maintain themselves to remain competitive on on the market for resales. You know who's doing the planning of where they put that quarter acre planter and not centering it over column? Their garden committee, not
right,
the engineer, not the developer, and that's why sometimes we find that things have gone completely astray because they have used a garden committee,
right.
and people who are not engineers, and they've just hired contractors to do this work, and it can present safety problems. No.
Yes, yes, it can. And if the drainage doesn't work, you have a lot of plants, and then you have a lot of water that builds up, and you have an irrigation system feeding the water in there, and water is heavy, and
You
you
know,
can cause structural issues.
I wanted to touch for a moment on construction going on inside the units. So just as these buildings have aged, you've got people who buy in an older building, they like the location, but the inside of the unit's terrible. It needs to be completely gutted and renovated. We're seeing that across the board. And you and I are seeing each other. You're shaking your head. Our listeners are only going to hear us, but I think you know where I'm going with this, that in the past,
You're
either
asking excellent questions.
too many boards have taken a hands off, just whatever, just show us that your contractor's licensed and insured. Well, we need a little bit more than that, because these interior unit renovations can destabilize a building, from what I've heard from other engineers, particularly, I guess, depending if it's total gutting and there's any drilling, and you tell me, post
Well,
tension
yeah, I
cable.
mean, I've come across where they've channeled in the floors, they've cut out beams, they've moved columns, it's all over the place. And really, what a condominium over time, what we've helped condominiums with, is set up window installation guidelines. So when a contractor comes in, we've established that you have to use these guidelines, i.e., you got to waterproof under the doors when you take them out. You got to use stainless steel fasteners. You have to have a mud bed. You don't put a door on a shim. That's just not, things of that nature. Okay. We also have waterproofing and tile installation guidelines. And there is no renovation or no structural renovation of any aspect in the building. I mean, inside a unit. Channeling a floor in the middle span of a unit can cause significant issues, because you're channeling into an element that may span 20 feet, and now you've taken out, so it could have a deflection issue. So there are a lot of things that boards can do to set up parameters
Mhm.
that all they're saying is, if you intend to do this, you need to tell us up front, or you're going to pay for us to have an engineer come in and
Right.
evaluate the condition that you did.
And perhaps periodic inspections of that unit renovation by the association's engineer, running the plans in front of the association engineers and getting that engineer's sign off ahead of time. I mean, certainly there needs to be some expanded protocols around unit renovations as opposed to just, are you using a licensed and insured contractor?
Right. And I can tell you, I had a building that was built, I think, in 1969 or something in Palm Beach, and someone bought the whole penthouse, 2 units, the whole penthouse, and they went and wanted to like completely, and they could. We had to sit them down, and I was that person that looked at the plan, called him up. Let's have a meeting. You can't do that. Here's a revision of that. Here's a revision, 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 and finally, we came into a point where, I can't live here not being able to do this. Well, that's where it was. We had to stand up because we weren't going to create a problem because he wanted to make it his dream house, Taj Mahal. We had to look at the association structure. So yeah, that was, unfortunately, that's how it worked. And it did work out in the long run, but there was a lot of very tense moments because they're passionate about it.
There's more than 50 years of case law in the state of Florida saying your home is your castle unless you live in a condo. So
Yeah.
that's kind of the answer to that. I did want to ask you, how do you highlight red flags in your reports when you find them?
Um, I've tried to, I go through and I've stated specifically, and then I go back in the recommendation. So there's really two places, you know, and you're at the beginning when you said you should put it up front. Um, that's it. It kind of goes on the thing when I go with a concrete restoration. I try not to tell them how much it costs until the end. So hopefully they listen why we're doing it as opposed to just giving the dollar value. But yeah, no, the at the end of the recommendations, I re-highlight it again and talk about specific things.
It would be helpful because, again, you're dealing with volunteer board members with differing levels of experience. As you said, you can have Fortune 500 CEOs and you can have college students sitting on these boards. It runs the gamut. It would be helpful if there was perhaps more guidance, more clarity in terms of timeline. For instance, sometimes an engineer will say you need emergency shoring work, right? You
Right.
need emergency shoring work. Let's take the garage. By the way, people can get killed in the garage. Chunk of concrete can fall off and hit them in the head walking into their car. So bad things can happen in garages. Um, what's an emergency? Does that mean within 72 hours you need to get this thing shored up? Within 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years?
Well, I would say this is that if it's an emergency, it needs to happen as soon as possible. I had another job recently that had a corner column in the building and had a significant, and it was about 30 feet in the air, so you really couldn't go up, but you could see it was bad. We shored that corner and fixed it, and it was a significant problem. But to get the permit, to get the shoring, to get the shoring engineer, that took about 6 weeks. Now that corner column had been there for 60 years. Okay,
Mm.
so 4 weeks and 60 years isn't really a long, but that was as fast as it could go. We were waived the permit by the city because it was emergency and things of that nature. And getting shoring in a column in a garage, single story garage, whatever, that could happen in a day or two, and that's just where it is. So it is all different. And
Right.
let's just say that I went to that column and I saw significant cracking that potentially was moving. We'd have to make a call and probably empty the building.
Right.
Okay, that has not happened to me. Okay, but that was under my direct charge as the engineer that I would have to make a call of that nature if I saw it.
But I need our listeners to understand that emergency means post haste. It
Yeah,
doesn't mean like, oh, Tim, we're going to have a meeting in 2 months and hopefully we'll get a quorum and then we'll start, looking around for contractors. And, if you've identified something that's significant, where you need emergency shoring, and the report really does highlight that it poses a potential life safety risk. That means now, folks. That means you have to start, and that means asking your engineer to work with the city or the county to expedite permits or even waive permits. I had one client, they waived the permit. They had it installed within 48 hours, the
Oh,
short
that's
report.
great. Well, that may also go back to what we started is the life safety issue. This is a this is emergency life safety issue. This potentially could be a life safety issue or, incident. This needs to happen. Now, that may be extreme, but it is what it is. And I'm going to say it's more rare than most, but there are issues that you have to shore. I mean, without a doubt. But a imminent failure is rare.
Do you have any follow-up with your clients? So in that instance where you needed emergency shoring, that 60-year-old column, and they say, thanks, Tim, but they never call you back. Is there follow-up involved with that to make sure that they've
That's
notified
an
the
excellent
residents?
question. I'm more towards the end of my engineering career. I've been doing this a long time, and I like to finish the game. Um, But no, if that happened and they went out, I would be writing a letter to the city, because I may drive by, I may give it a week, whatever, and go by, but I would end up, doing the right thing, reporting it because we don't need anyone to get hurt that we could avoid getting hurt. I mean, that's just where it is. And
Right.
and they don't do it because of a dollar value. A life is much more important than a dollar. So
And sometimes it's not even about saving a dollar, it's just that delusion abounds.
I've seen a
They
lot in
just
my 36 years. I mean, I've seen the brawls, I've seen it all. Um,
I've seen the guy who said that the $5 million special assessment for all the maintenance and repair work, that he could find somebody for 12,000 to make these repairs. And stand up at a meeting and say, "This is crazy. I have a guy who can do this for 12,000."
well, it speaks for itself. But there's people that will listen to them. And
There was
that's
a
just where it
handful
is.
that listened to him
You
because
know,
you want to hear what you want to hear.
right, right. So.
But boards have a tough listen. I've always said that it's a tough job sitting on a board. It's never been tougher than right now because once these deadlines get closer and they really have to start writing checks for engineers, for the reserve studies, and then of course for all the repair projects, there will be people that unfortunately will no longer be able to live in some coastal communities. It's just the reality.
And that's exactly it. And that's I feel bad, but you have to you can't modify the requirement to do your job to consider financial difficulties. You can always work through that outside, but my job is to report what the integrity of the building, what the issues are, what we project the cost is, and how we would do that. How that's addressed in the timeline, is I'll work and I'll help and whatever we need to do. But you're absolutely right. Someone that bought this condo for $150,000 45 years ago, it may have passed them by, and it's unfortunate, but that's just where it is because you have to maintain the structure. That's
Yep.
where it is.
And our job as council is to figure out how they can pay for these, whether it's gonna be a
Right.
special assessment or a loan, and to make sure we review the contracts. So whoever's doing all this work, that they're gonna get what they're bargaining for.
Right.
I just have two more questions, and I've been so grateful for your time. I've had a lot of guests on the podcast talking about the property insurance crisis in Florida. But it's getting hard
It's
to get
another
all
podcast.
it's getting hard to get all kinds of coverage. And I wanted to talk to you about professional liability coverage. Has it gotten much more difficult post
Yes, it
Surfside?
is, and more expensive because of the litigious nature of associations.
Yeah.
Um, I fix broken buildings. We do our job and then hire a contractor that may or may not do his job. But as the engineer of record or project manager or both, however we are, we're looking, we should have known better, we should have done better. And quite frankly, in the contracts, ways, means, and methods is a huge issue. And if contractors are not properly staffed or stretched over or financially burdened, it affects the work. And, the engineer or the professional, I'm going to say, can be burdened by that. And it's unfortunate. I've been lucky. I kind of have a saying: if you're in the now, you're too late. I'm a month ahead. I want to be a month ahead, and if it gets to where we're okay, I'm still a month ahead because I just have seen it all. And I guess what I'd rather say is some of these contractors have their interest in front of the association's interest, and you really need to hold them to the fire. I mean, that's what there's some of these 5 million. There's big money. There's big money involved, and people that are it's financially strapping. They should get what you contracted for. And when there's more and more work out there and things of that nature, it seems like we do more babysitting. I can't put it in any better way than that.
You know what? It's not. It's certainly not business as usual post Surfside. I would imagine for engineers, at least engineers who have their eyes on the ball, that they understand the heightened risks. And there was an engineer who went out to Champlain Towers, bid on the project, didn't get hired, but got sued.
I know that engineer,
Yeah.
and it's unfortunate. It's the worst case of anything that we do as professionals. Um, to have really done nothing and to be liable for that is it's just hard to believe. But that engineer is a very good engineer too.
Excellent engineer, but it does underscore, at least to me, that there are significant risks for engineers, especially in this new landscape, and it's got to be tough to get the amount of coverage that you potentially need. That
It,
being
it
s-
is, but at the same token too is all I can do is protect what I can protect, and that is to run. My job is not just to say yes or no. My job is to manage the project. My job is to keep the ownership informed and why things are happening up front to try to avert some of the problems that are happening. You're never going to avert every problem. And there's always going to be the one person or the three person in the association that are never happy, and that's just unfortunate about it. But the liability aspect goes through with property insurance, hurricane insurance, all of this. Everyone is CYAing themselves. It's just how it is right now.
I feel with such a somber, dark topic, I should ask something uplifting like, "What's your favorite hobby?" or "What makes you happy?"
Well, I could talk. I mean, I would love to sit and talk to you about hurricane insurance. And right now, it's going through with hurricane insurance. They're going in and beating their liability by telling you need to replace your roof. No
Yeah.
ands, ifs, or buts. You can have a perfectly good roof. I mean, it's old, but they don't care. It's 20 years. We don't care if you've maintained it. It's 20 years old. We don't want the liability.
You're hitting a nerve with me. I just had to replace a 25-year-old roof personally, and it was fine. But yeah, I had that conversation with my insurance agent.
Yeah, and I bet it was rather loud.
Yeah, it wasn't pleasant. Let me put it that way.
Right.
Well,
No.
let me ask you last question. What can the average community resident do to become more aware of their building's condition? I mean, I guess the first thing I would think is open your eyes when you're walking around, right?
Well, I would just say this. I mean, of course, look around. But the other thing, ask questions. A crack, is it just a surface crack? Is it a structural crack? Where is it located? How big is it? Is it bleeding rust? I mean, these are basic questions. And that, oh, that's been like that for years. Well, if it's been like that for years, the chances are that it's not very good, you know. So, but it's pretty basic. The other thing, I got to find a qualified professional to come through, and it doesn't have to be and I'm not just talking about milestone. It can be a walk around and ask questions. That person should be able to answer you in basic terms. And if it's a more complicated matter, look, I need to do this, or I got to look at the plans. I can't really tell you, but this is what I see, and take action because it's cheaper now than it is later.
And if there's an agenda item on your board or membership meeting that relates to the building safety, to an engineering report, I would urge people to attend those meetings.
Absolutely.
It's not a meeting you want to miss. So how can people find you?
Um, Tim at atdesigns.net. We are located in North Palm Beach. My phone number is 561 Um, get on the web, and that's just where it is. So I
Your phone's
appreciate
gonna
you
be
having.
ringing. Your phone's gonna be ringing off the hook, Tim. Thank you so much for joining us
Thank
today.
you
You've
very
given us
much,
a lot to
and
think
enjoy
about.
your vacation.
I will. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you.
Okay, we're done. I hope that was painless.
It was a lot. It sometimes starts out a little difficult, but it went. I mean, listen, hurricane insurance, windows. We have more to talk about.
Yeah, we do. So I'll have you back on again. I was just going to ask you, is there anything that I should have asked you that I didn't ask you?
No, I think it went. It covered actually a broader spectrum than I had anticipated, but I thought it went well.
Well, my partner, Ken Director, speaks so highly of you. And so when I was looking for an engineer, he said, you got to have Tim.